healthy social and emotional development. There's a but, and it's a big but. None of us, not one of us, is born knowing how to handle big feelings. This is something that takes a long time to learn. And if they don't learn it immediately, this is okay, because there's time. There's plenty of time to learn this and figure it out. In the meantime, the job for us as parents, as providers, as caregivers, as aunts and uncles, as adults in other children's lives, and being the ones that care about them, is to nurture this ability to learn how to respond when there are big feelings. Part of the reason why I focused on ages, 3 to 5, 3 to 6, is that prior to that, what we're seeing in kids when we're having big feelings, we think of terrible twos, we think of tantrums. Those are a little bit different. Those are more responding to environment and not having maybe the verbal communication skills until we get to that point. So I want to make that distinction. I'm going to focus on 3 different kinds of social and emotional development. I know it's going to seem like I'm throwing a lot of information at you, so I will kind of make you take a break between each section. What makes my job very challenging is that often by the time any of you would show up in my office, I'm hearing about the problems. We're having difficulties with behaviors. In a perfect world, I would love to sit down with every parent that comes into my office and give them this presentation so that I can come at it from an educational standpoint, because information is power, and understanding how kids develop helps us know what we need to do to approach them. And also, you are the #1 expert on your child. I will always honor that. And understanding that your unique child is coming at things differently will give you the perspective on how to apply each of these concepts and how social emotional development happens. The 3 main areas of social emotional development I'm going to cover today are social interaction, emotional awareness, and self-regulation. These seem pretty self-explanatory maybe, but I'm going to try to give some pretty specific examples of what that looks like. So we're going to start with social interaction. Social interaction is the relationships that we have with others. For purposes of what we're talking about today, this includes adults and peers, and what we're going to be looking at as typical social and emotional development, and how kids learn to interact with their peers and with other adults affects how they in turn handle the big feelings that we're going to talk about today. The second type is emotional awareness. Maybe 5 to 10 years ago, you might have heard the buzzword of things like emotional intelligence, because that kind of puts things at either you have it or you don't. The word has switched to awareness. We want kids to be aware, be able to label feelings, be able to recognize feelings, plus being able to know how their feelings and actions might affect other people. And the third type of social emotional development, which is a big challenge in the young child state that we're going to talk about today, is self-regulation. This is something that you're going to hear more and more about, and this is the challenge that comes of this stage and any other following. And this is where I'll take an asterisk and talk about right now. Most of us are having to learn how to self-regulate in a totally different way right now, not in a way we would have ever expected. To be more specific, self-regulation is how you control yourself by using what you have, your ability to calm yourself down and how to cheer yourself up when you're not feeling great. But also being able to express your thoughts and feelings in a way that other people can understand what you're feeling, of saying, this is what I need to get to a different emotional state. So those are the 3 things I'm going to cover. We're going to start with social interaction. Some of the milestones, what we call typical milestones, beginning around age 3. So maybe we're starting preschool at this point. Some of the things that we want to see in terms of social interaction that will show us that development is occurring at the rate and in the way that we want it to are things like showing concern for others without having to prompt or intervene, copying the adults and peers that they have in their environment, taking turns in games. This is something that's a milestone that you might start to see. That doesn't mean it's perfected. Separating from parents, knowing that they will be able to trust the adults in their environment if it's a new environment, and that mom and dad will come back and they can rely on that. Showing a wide range of feelings. This is when we start to see a lot more color and a lot more nuance when it comes to feelings, because they're experiencing the world in a more dynamic way. But also around age 3, one of the more typical milestones is enjoying a routine, liking things to be the same, and being upset with major changes. Obviously right now, things are not quite working that way. But then another is enjoying helping adults. So these are things that we're looking for that in turn, if we see those things and they're working well, kids are able to manage their feelings well. We get into that second year of preschool age 4, we're going to be seeing more things on the positive side of playing cooperatively, learning how to negotiate conflicts. I know that these are the times where we start hearing kids kind of trying to figure out things on their own. And even though it might not always flow smoothly, another milestone of this age is still, even though it's hard and resolving conflict is not something that comes naturally at age 4, they still would rather play with other kids than be alone. So they start to enjoy that and look forward to it. On top of that is enjoying doing new things and being exposed to new ideas. Being more creative in make-believe play, things like playing house, role playing with different professions. These are social ways that kids interact with each other that let us know how they're encountering their world. But within that, sometimes there is a confusion of what's real and what's make-believe. That's typical development. That's a milestone around that age. Also, expressing likes and dislikes. You're going to hear a lot more within this age group of what they like and what they don't like. And that's an expressive ability, and that's an important thing to be able to develop. And also actively seeking out new experiences. And moving on to age 5. So maybe we're in kindergarten, maybe we're getting close. We're starting to see peers at this age socially mirroring a little bit more of how kids want to act and how they want to emulate their peers. They want to please their friends, or they want to be like their friends and do the things that their friends are doing. But also we start to see wanting to be a rule follower, agreeing to rules more easily, sort of getting the idea that things will go more smoothly for them when they follow the rules. And again, at this age, more singing, more dancing, more pretend play, more, exuberance and joy at being fully invested in imaginative play. But once we're getting to age 5, we're starting to kind of differentiate out more, knowing the difference between fantasy and reality. They can fully enjoy the fantasy, but they'll understand by age 5, more or less, the difference between fantasy and reality. Independence. I think that the biggest leap of independence that we often see is that difference of beginning, age 5 to kindergarten to that first year. That first year is so much development and so much more independence of learning all the things that they can do on their own. And this can be pretty exciting for kids. And with that independence is seeking new experiences and wanting to have more of that. But, and this is the fun milestone, the last one, which is being fully cooperative, but also being demanding and wanting to run the show. This can be part of the social challenge at the time because they want so much to please their friends, but they also don't want to do what their friends are doing all the time either. So it's a push and pull. It's a dynamic. Within the milestones that we've talked about, everything that I've included so far are things that are typical, things that we want to see. But there are some things that might need to be addressed and might need a little more attention. And these are some of the red flags. Not being able to initiate or join in play. This is, outside of when you're in a new environment, first day of school, first time starting in a play group, first time in a class. We have to give kids some grace and some leeway, but if it's something that continues on, even when it's kids that they're familiar with, that might be a red flag that we need to spend a little more time and attention on social development. The second one is not being able to share at all with other children. When I have parents in my office who are talking about challenges with sharing, part of what sometimes needs to happen is having a conversation about what sharing is, or the little trick that sometimes works of, if your child has a preferred toy that they don't want to share, before they have that play date or before they have that interaction, what can be really helpful is saying, hey, this is your favorite toy. Maybe we need to put this away if you really don't want to have anyone else play with it. And that can give kids a sense of ownership, a sense of understanding, of knowing that, okay, mom and dad see that this is important to me and they're not going to make me share it. Because then it becomes a conversation versus sitting and waiting for, their friend's going to pull this toy that's their favorite toy, and then bedlam ensues. Another red flag is if kids within this age group are dependent on caregivers and teachers for everything, every little thing. Yes, I know when they're at this age, they ask for help, and they do need help legitimately on so many things. But part of what teachers do and parents and caregivers that promotes development is giving those small little pushes, those little opportunities for doing things on their own. Another is extreme sustained difficulty separating from caregiver. We often see the honeymoon period within the first couple of days or first couple of times or attempts, and then it starts to get more difficult. If it's difficult and we're talking days, weeks, months, and they're not able to separate from you, that's a red flag that maybe something needs to be addressed when it comes to social development. And then we talked about routine and how much children at these ages enjoy routine, but when it's extremely rigid and no changes are allowed and no flexibility is really being embraced, no matter how well prepared you are or how much advance notice kids get of these things, if they're still remaining extremely rigid, there might need to be some intervention for that. But then the last one, and this is having to do with what social interaction is, meaning wanting to be with other peers and share with other peers. Beyond, initial fearfulness or timidity is being passive, being completely passive, and not wanting to engage at all with other peers. There's a lot to be said for kids needing to learn how to be independent and play on their own. But also, if that's what they prefer and they refuse it completely, then that's something socially that we need to be more concerned about and take a look at what we need to do. Before I go on to our next section, which is emotional intelligence, Adam, do we have any questions that we should do right now? Take a break for? Because I can't see the questions on my screen. I can't see the chat.
I've got it. I'm double checking here. Okay. So this is the first question, and it comes, here's the question. When a child refuses to share a toy in a group setting, such as preschool, what are some strategies that can be used by teachers to mitigate this?
Part of what can be done, particularly in a larger group setting like that, is if it's something that's repeatedly happening and it's a preferred toy by all, then sometimes what can help is before there's any type of open play like that is having a conversation saying, hey, this is everybody's favorite toy before we start playing today, whether it's deciding to have equal amounts of time or figuring out who gets to have the first turn. But prevention tends to be better than reaction of waiting for something to happen. So if you know it's a preferred toy, trying to, let kids know that you are aware of it as, the adult in the room, and that you're going to negotiate out a solution for everybody can sometimes ease that a little bit. But then, part of it too is letting kids know and having even just that conversation. I know this is everybody's favorite toy and everyone wants to play with it. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to each have this amount of time. If it's one of those things where you try sharing it and it's not working, then we want to think about incorporating some more specific things like having a timer or having things already planned out of in what order everyone's going to get to play it with. What happens most of the time with younger kids when we start to do that, some kids decide that it's not worth it and they stop fighting over it. So that's just my experience with it. Or it goes the other way. Sometimes once they realize they're going to have a limited amount of time, they will wait. They will be as patient as they need to be to make sure they get time with whatever that preferred item is.
That's it for questions so far.
Okay. I love the questions. They're so helpful.
I'll just say real quickly, because some people did join us a few minutes late. If you wish to ask a question, please feel free to use the chat. Typically down at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a pop-up, and just shoot us a question. We'll take some breaks throughout the presentation, and we'll answer any questions.
Great. Thank you, Adam. So the next type of social and emotional development we're going to talk about is what is now being called emotional awareness. 5 to 10 years ago in the field, we were still calling it emotional intelligence. I'm not quite sure where and how and when this change happened, but I think the verbiage changed because we wanted to foster it as something that everyone should have access to, and not necessarily delineating it as some kids have it, some kids don't, because that's not really fair. Emotional awareness is something that, and emotional intelligence is something that can be fostered in any child, in anyone, when it's at their level and developmentally appropriate and put in a context that they can understand. So what emotional awareness means is teaching kids how to talk about feelings and emotions. How we do that is by pictures, by helping them identify scenes and things that they're already familiar with. But also the dialogue needs to be open all the time of what feelings are happening, even with their peers, letting peers suggest what's happening, but keeping things open-ended, that there doesn't have to be a right answer about this scene is this exact feeling or this character is experiencing this exact thing. What's important about teaching kids and teaching them to become more emotionally aware is that things are open-ended. And on top of that, how we model feelings for children as adults. Not only how we model, how we handle things, but continuing to label things. When I have young children in my office and young families in my office, I will tell them what I will tell all of you right now, which is you cannot talk about feelings too much. You cannot use too many feeling words in a day with young children, because sponges, they're soaking it all in. And particularly with big feelings and with negative emotions, it can get colored in such a stark or strong way that if we don't label it specifically about how things make us feel, then it becomes a negative thing, and then kids start to shut down and not want to talk about it. And I'm gonna go into that a little bit more. There are so many wonderful resources. If you're on Google or you're in Pinterest and you start looking for feelings charts, There is no shortage. And I have found that there is not, unfortunately, a one size fits all. Kids are very specific when it comes to what they relate to. I've given you a couple of examples here. Emojis are probably the most popular right now because kids have the most exposure to them. But even if it's something that doesn't necessarily resonate with them immediately, even just talking about like the jelly bean example that I have here, sometimes kids, you know, at a young age will look at it and think it's just so outrageous and so silly that I think it's important to share those extremes with them and ask them about what they see and why they think it's silly or extreme. And that can often be a gauge of maybe just their own comfort level with talking about feelings. If things are looking way too specific for them, or they're not understanding something, that's a venue to conversation. That's a venue to, well, what's the difference between scared and confused? They look kind of the same. Dialogue, conversation. And the cool thing is that anything that kids regularly interact with is an opportunity to talk about feelings. If it's their favorite movie, their favorite book, you know, in the video games that they play. Once we start using the language as the adults in their life and start filling in these sort of feeling words for them, and we model, then it becomes the norm. Then it's not a question of if things are good or bad. It's really important, and this is me being a parent and me being a professional. It's really important that kids understand at this young age about feelings not being good or bad. Feelings are feelings. Feelings are any and everything, and they're dynamic. It's not one end or the other. And I think the more we open the conversation, the more we develop that emotional awareness. And what that does when we give kids the language, when we give them all the colors of the palette to use, they can learn how to express and how to manage these big feelings, which is the focus of, you know, our topic today. There's no shortage, like I said, on Google, on Pinterest. Look at them with your kids, see what resonates with them, that you want to find a way to communicate feelings with them. And that if they find something that they gravitate towards or that resonates with them, let that be the vehicle for conversation. Because the more we can talk about it, the better kids get at regulating how they feel. And this has some tools, but I'm going to go on to that. I've given some examples in this slide of books that you can use. Books are a great way to develop emotional awareness. And these are some of the classic ones that are great. But I will make the statement that any book, any story, any movie, anything that your kids love can be used to illustrate and to develop the conversation about feelings. And sometimes bringing in an unknown, or we can get the idea in our heads as parents of, okay, I've got this great book and I'm going to use it. And sometimes it just won't hit. It won't take off with them. So using something that they're already familiar with and taking a pause and saying, what do you think that character's thinking or feeling? Because the only downside to some of these books is that they use pretty extreme examples. And because kids from 3 to 5, when we're talking about young kids, sometimes they can see that and can shut down a little bit or be a little overwhelmed by it and say, oh, I can't relate to that. So it doesn't always work as well as one might hope. So these are wonderful examples. You can look at the examples that I've provided, but I encourage all of you to use things that your kids already like to read. And maybe because I've done it a lot with parents, we don't always think about how the things that our kids gravitate towards might be the things that they sort of start to internalize of this is how I see this character doing it, so that's how I'm going to do it. Part of what needs to happen sometimes is, again, conversation about what that looks like and why it's important to talk about feelings. There's a lot to be said here, but I'll take another breather if we have some more questions and we want to talk about developing emotional awareness with kids.
Yep, let me see what I've got here. Actually, the other question was asking me if we're recording this and will be posted. And the answer is yes, we are recording it and it will be posted. I will apologize. Adriana, I actually forgot to hit record until about 30, 40 seconds into it. So we missed the first half minute to a minute. But yes, it will be posted. That's it for questions right now.
Okay. Yes, it will be posted. So I thought about it today of how's it going to work for parents when we're all home and stuck with each other, being able to sneak away and do this. So I know I've had to sneak away when I could to consume the things that I want. So it's great that you guys are recording this. So when people get a chance to, they can sit down and take it in. So the last thing I'm going to talk about when it comes to social emotional development is self-regulation. The who's who and the experts in the field of child development are really hammering down these days on self-regulation. Now, in previous years and in my work as a therapist, self-regulation was typically not always talked about unless you're talking about kids with behavioral issues or things like ADHD, kids on the autism spectrum. But what we know from studying young children is that self-regulation is often the key to developing skills to manage our feelings. And this is not just in childhood, this is throughout our lifetimes. I wish I could remember who specifically said it, but someone that I look up to as a psychologist said that self-regulation is the new milestone that kids need to be developing. All kids need to be developing to be successful adults, to be successful in their relationships, to learn how to manage, and that teaching kids, the younger the better, about self-regulation is what will prevent things like anxiety and prevent behavioral difficulties, because this is sort of the bread and butter. And I'm going to talk about why. Why is self-regulation important? When children become more able and more aware of how they respond to things, just being able to regulate and being able to be aware of it, they will be less vulnerable when bad things happen, when trauma happens. What we're seeing in the times that we're living in right now, and particularly because they are so uncertain, is that anxiety is at a high for most of us and for kids as well. But for those children who maybe have developed some more abilities and more awareness when it comes to self-regulation and what they need, they're the ones that are going to weather the storm, no matter what happens. And sometimes the word that we use for that is resiliency. But resiliency is also hand in hand with self-regulation. Healthy self-regulation, when it's working well, gives kids the emotional resources to have those healthy friendships, but also the capacity to focus and to learn when they need to. And healthy self-regulation is a strong predictor of academic success. Without going too far into specific issues, what I see in young children when we feel like things aren't working and kids are having a hard time to focus and paying attention and being able to be part of the classroom and part of the group or part of any of these kind of things. Just the act of being able to be part and to participate in a full way has to do with self-regulation. Can kids manage their feelings in order to get things done that they need to get done? What we're finding with a lot of kids that maybe 10 years ago were diagnosed with things like ADD or behavioral difficulties, we're looking at it behaviorally now and knowing that those are kids who didn't develop the self-regulation skills that they needed in order to function well in the classroom. So that's why self-regulation is important. When we're talking about young kids, we see a lot of high emotion and a lot of big feelings, which is what we're focusing on today. I know it's hard to do it in the moment because when it happens, it's overwhelming and we want to feel like we need to fix it. But just to put the positive spin on things, do we want to view them solely as outbursts, solely as problems, or do we want to look at them as opportunities? Because I'm a parent, I will not judge another parent who has their child with them who's having a tantrum because I know it's not a sign of bad parenting. I know that it's not a sign that it's a bad kid. I know that any outburst is a child trying to regulate what's happening within their body, and that includes big feelings. And within that, what works one time doesn't always work the next. That's what makes feelings very tricky and not a linear path. So that's why I want to encourage all of you who are on this path that, you know, nothing is going to be a straight line every time. But what we bring or what we choose to take out of any of these big expressions of feelings is an opportunity to steer them in a different direction. It's an opportunity to maybe strengthen the skills that they have. And going back to what we talked about, naming feelings, naming emotions, learning about what helps them to regulate their feelings. So, easier said than done, I know. Within that, I did feel like it was important for me to talk about what this is looking like right now, because we're all taking on a different role than we ever would have expected that we would have had to take on as parents. And that's being teacher, social worker, everything rolled into one. So now that we're the ones that are saddled with also doing social emotional learning in a different way than we would have expected, I wanted to just give some ideas, and there'll be more, but you know, specifically, we are the models that our kids are seeing, and part of what helps kids develop the abilities is by the models that they see around them. Within that, some of the things that I wanted to keep in mind are things like monitoring your own stress levels, and connecting with your kids and letting them know that you're stressed in a way that they will know that they're not alone in perhaps what they're feeling. Sticking to a schedule, this is one that I know is not always easy to do, easier said than done, but a loose structure, something that gives some room, gives some latitude, because all of us are learning this and all of us are doing it in a different way than we may have planned to do. But if you're beating down the door of academics and social emotional learning and it's not working, then consider other things that you can teach your kids at this time. Life skills, doing laundry, cooking, learning to manage a budget, all of these things that, you know, we now call quote unquote adulting, things that we want our kids to learn, but perhaps prior to this, we would have said, well, there's not time. There's school, there's practice, there's lessons, there's all these different things that we have on our plate. And now our plate's been cleared a little bit. So that can be another opportunity. But also avoiding conflict before it happens. this is something that takes a little while to develop, but now that most of us are a few weeks in, I think we're kind of learning when to jump in and when to hold back. And part of that is development. Part of that is teaching our kids and teaching our kids about social emotional learning. But also, you know, I wanted to include, you know, finding resources when we need them. So I'm going to talk more about this as we kind of go. But if we want to talk about specifically the concepts that we've been talking about today, so it comes to managing big feelings. And I know I'm kind of truncating this in the middle, and I'll get more to the end about specific strategies. But when we're talking about what can we do within our, you know, day-to-day life right now of how to teach our kids to be more emotionally aware, this is an acronym that I've used for a lot of years. And the great thing about it is that it evolves over time. And when kids are young, when we employ these habits and we use them regularly, and things kind of coast for a while, and then things get hard again, it's something we can return to. So the acronym is RULER. The R is recognizing emotions in self and others. For young children, if that's, you know, since that's the focus of what we're talking about today, sometimes that means playing a guessing game, but maybe being wrong. Labeling of feelings for kids can often be the gateway to the conversation of, it looks like you're feeling this way. And then they say, no, that's not what it is. So that can be often the starting point. Beyond that, moving on to the U in RULER, is understanding the causes and consequences of emotions. This is where what I talked about a little bit ago of not labeling emotions as good or bad can be really, really important. We want to talk about consequences. If there's an emotion that then leads to a behavior, then we need to talk about consequences. But it's often hard for kids to tease out whether that means that emotion was then bad. It's important for kids to understand that it's not the emotions that are bad, it's the actions and the consequences that come from that. The L in RULER is for labeling emotions accurately. That goes back to what I was talking about just a bit ago of sometimes we can be wrong. We can think that someone's feeling something, but without asking and without having the conversation, we could be veering off and not getting what they're trying to say. And most kids love the opportunity to correct their parents when we're wrong. So that's why I think labeling tends to be very helpful in learning how to process and how to develop that emotional awareness that we're looking for. Within that also follows nicely the E in RULER for expressing emotions appropriately. We want to think about time and place. We want to think about the response versus the size of the problem, the response versus what the issue really is. Yes, I know. With young children, we're talking about things that may seem very small, but it's important for us to talk about the size of the reaction and whether it's merited to whatever the size of the problem is. And then the last R in RULER, regulating, talking about regulating all over again. Most importantly in this process, when you're teaching kids about how to handle these big feelings they have, is to be kind to yourself. Be kind, because this stuff isn't easy. This isn't meant to be handled and dealt with all at once or dealt with perfectly every time, because we are only human. And I think kids need to hear that. Kids need to know when we may have overstepped or understepped or not done the right thing. Kids need to know that, because then what that does as a model is it lets them know that, oh, wow, mom and dad messed up too, but we talked about it, or, we learned about when and why we say sorry. That's a whole other thing. Before I talk about, I'm going to talk about anxiety next, and then I'm going to talk about some more specific strategies. I had a little flash that I had some questions, so I'll take a breather.
Okay, wonderful. Some great questions here. Okay, first one is, within the spectrum of autism, when do we have to be concerned about self-regulating?
When do we have to be concerned?
Yeah,
I
within the
think
spectrum of autism.
within the spectrum of autism. Well, I have 2 kids on the spectrum, so I can speak to this pretty well. I think it comes down to self-regulating and being able to be a participant in the things that they're doing. I know that self-regulation can sometimes be a challenge because those behaviors in and of themselves can kind of pull them away from things, and we still want young kids on the spectrum to be participants in the way that they can, in the way that they're able to. But I also know that part of what makes self-regulation so challenging is that it can often be the thing that then takes their focus away from whatever they're doing, and then that becomes primary versus, you know, whatever the goal of the actual activity is. I tend to believe as a parent that when my children return to their particular self-regulating behaviors, that there needs to be a space for them to do that and a time, but also still everything else that I was talking about, that there still needs to be a conversation. It may not be the same kind of conversation, but when you notice, you know, if you have kids with autism and you notice that they're returning to those particular behaviors, that can often be sort of the trigger moment of, okay, what do I need to take a look at in terms of what's happening in the moment, and what can we do to give them the space to do that, but then integrate them back into whatever they're doing. I don't know if I answered the question. It's kind of a tough question.
I've got another one for you.
Okay.
Let me just make sure I line this up. Okay. This is a little more lengthy. Is it normal for a child to become more emotional than normal when they turn 5? It's almost like she's going through a midlife crisis. Everything seems to be a problem and is a major emotional response when it comes to basic daily activities that wouldn't normally be an issue for her. I don't know how to help her through what is going on with her right now.
Oh, that's hard. I'm really sorry to hear that. I, as someone who works with kids of all ages, I'm going to tell the person that asked this question that teenagers and young children have a lot in common, which is that exact helpless feeling that you're talking about of not knowing what to do because everything's not working. And I'm going to talk a little bit more in my next segment about some ways to approach that. But I think overall, what we call it sometimes is being the potted plant parent, which is when everything is a struggle and it's not going well, often our response is to jump in and try to manage and try to fix all of the time, when in fact, part of the developmental challenge of this stage is those big feelings. We need to give it some space and some time, and maybe I can explain it a little more. You know, I'm going to explain it more a little bit as we go on, but part of it is if you're gripping like this and you're white knuckling and your child is struggling too, then there has to be a pullback, because you're not going to get anywhere. If your child is struggling through day-to-day stuff and you're trying to nail them on it, then there needs to be a pullback, and there needs to be a let's start over. It's kind of my approach to things, and I'll talk more about the specifics of why that works in my sort of next section of things.
If it's okay, I've got one last question. I think it's a really great one, but pretty straightforward. Is it best to address quote unquote big feelings when they're happening, such as in the store, at preschool, at church, or wait until the child has calmed down?
I'm going to talk about that specifically in the next section. When it's happening, generally is not a good time. It's like the meme that goes around of no one has calmed down in the history of calming down when someone tells them to calm down. It's something that we do instinctually to each other as adults, as kids. But when we're upset and someone tells us to calm down, that generally doesn't work. There's a lot of what I call side doors, windows, back entries to talking about these things, because handling them head on when they're happening, particularly when these feelings are so big, is not going to be effective. That's part of why, what I've talked about is hammering those concepts into your kids all the time, because then when the big feelings happen, then they have the vocabulary to handle it. When we're in our most vulnerable states, we're generally not going to be as open to suggestion. And that's just something that we know from what can we do when kids are at the highest. We have to write it out. So I'm going to talk more specifically about that. When we talk about younger children, and if the focus today is on, ages 3 to 5, anxiety feels like a big word, like a heavy word. We don't want to use that. But what we know from kids who've experienced a lot of trauma and a lot of difficulty in their life, that there are signs that kids can experience anxiety at this age. And it may be more than just the typical. And, I'm probably going to hit a lot of checkpoints for all of you right now, because you're having your kids in a more highly anxious state, and your kids are probably more anxious than they usually are. So when we talk about physical signs, things like headache, stomach ache, not wanting to eat at school, not wanting to use bathrooms except at home, not as much of an issue right now, obviously. Being restless, being fidgety, distracted and not necessarily focusing. Those are, physical things that we can see about kids that might let us know that they're experiencing anxiety. And then the last one, which could be a whole other presentation in and of itself, is falling and staying asleep. That can be a big stressor for us as parents. And that can become the battle that can't be won at this particular age. And that has to do not just with anxiety, but with figuring out what works for them. And typically at this age, what works will work until it doesn't, until the next thing comes along. But if your kids do have a hard time falling asleep or staying asleep at night, it could be a possible signal of anxiety, with something to keep in mind. And again, signs, emotional signs of anxiety, these are tough at this age because we generally see more of it. Feelings are bigger, things get expressed in just a more broad way all the time. So these are, sort of basic ideas of, your child might be anxious if they're showing emotional signs of being extremely sensitive, crying all the time, being afraid of making minor mistakes, perfectionism. Phobias are exaggerated fears. It's typical for kids to have fears at this age. But if it's a fear that's then impeding and keeping them away from things that they do normally enjoy doing, that might be something that needs to be looked at. But then within that is if they're not playing or not wanting to play because their fears are jumping in and they're worried that something's going to happen or worried that something's going to take them out of that activity, that could be a sign of possible, anxiety. It's important to distinguish that emotionally is different from behaviorally. We might not always see the kid who's crying all the time, but we might see some of these behavioral indicators. If you have a child that's constantly asking what if questions, what if there's an earthquake? What if there's a snowstorm? What if we get in a car crash? But within that, behaviorally, things that we'll see that they're doing is avoiding being in things like circle time, avoiding taking part in group activities. Or when they are involved in group activities, they might be silent or they might not want to participate. Big behavioral sign, kids are refusing to go to school, afraid to go to school. I don't want to go to school. And on top of that, avoiding situations, not wanting to interact with their peers. This could be, a sign of anxiety. Another one that's not as common in terms of parents don't necessarily red flag it behaviorally is when kids are constantly seeking approval. And part of that becomes a difficult one to notice, because that's a pretty big hallmark of kids at a young age, is wanting approval from others. But another behavioral sign of anxiety is the kid that you can know as a parent, as a teacher, as a professional, that your child is fully able to do things, but becomes the I can't do it kid. I don't know how to do it. I can't do it. That can be a sign of anxiety, of I don't know how to start, so I can't. It's one that I hear a lot. Now, to go back to some of the questions that we had, so that I can, give you all some more specific ideas of how to help kids handle big feelings. This is the hardest. This is the most challenging. This is the most difficult. But before you start or engage or have a conversation when it comes to big feelings, and if you feel like your children aren't handling it well, we need to calm ourselves first. Taking a pause, taking a deep breath before we jump in, before we engage, noticing how we feel, noticing what's in our bodies. Part of what happens sometimes, and this is something that we don't always tune into until we experience a kid around us that's having a big feeling, is that we can start to knowingly or unknowingly kind of take these things in. And why it's important to calm yourself first is to take a moment to check in, to say, how am I feeling today? Have I eaten today? Am I hydrated? Am I tired? Because once you've checked in and you've calmed yourself first, you will know that anything you encounter outside of that is not you. And that's why it's important. But also, like I've said here, reminding yourself that your goal should be to calm the storm. Now, the question before was, do we jump right in when it's happening? Most likely no, because anything that's going to happen isn't going to get you the results that you want. We want to, I want to give the caveat of, obviously we want to be concerned about personal safety and not harming themselves or others. But are we going to get them to understand that this is what's happening right now when it's actually happening? Probably not. We need to take that and jump in at a different time. But anything that you encounter, a lot of the time, if you jump in and you feel like it's not working, it's not about you. It's about what they're experiencing. And if it's a big feeling, it's going to be overwhelming, and they're not going to know how to express that to you unless we develop these things that we've talked about today. When you talk to your kids about big feelings, as I've said before, we want to balance the negative and the positive. And within that, we want to avoid absolutes, good or bad, black or white, all or nothing. We want to use the modifiers when we can, of sometimes, or maybe this, or maybe that. We don't want to make it yes, no, always, never. Those are things that can make kids shut down and not want to talk about how they feel. When we respond, it's important to not be dismissive, because for kids, particularly at this young age, we can look at how they're reacting and we can say, I gave you the red cup instead of the blue cup. Who cares? We can look at it from a logical standpoint, and it's easy for us to be dismissive because we can just look at what they're doing or what the issue was, and we can roll our eyes. But if we're dismissive about how they felt in a particular moment or particular situation, like, oh, I'll get over it, it's no big deal, that's one of those things that starts to become something that shuts the door on talking about it, on knowing that big feelings are okay. But, you know, to go back to how we respond, responding calmly will mean that when your child does calm down, that it should be easier for them to talk to you about what it was. No matter how it goes, no matter what happens or how much or how little you get out of them or whether they're able to express it, it's really important to compliment kids when they try. Compliment them on their efforts of, thank you for telling me. You did a good job of letting me know how that made you feel. And then the last, thing that I've included on this one is, offering suggestions, but also helping them brainstorm, throw out a lot of different ideas, throw out some outrageous ideas so that they can, get you, they can say, oh, well, mom's got no idea. Mom doesn't understand. The adult equivalent I can give is when you are going through a hard time with a friend or at work or, with a peer, and you go and you talk to your spouse or you go and you talk to your best friend and you just want to rant to them. You don't want them to suggest anything. You don't want them to tell you how to fix it. You just want them to listen. Kids want the same thing. They want that space to not be told it's right or wrong or good or bad, but it is what it is. And that's oversimplifying it. But part of, offering suggestions and brainstorming keeps the conversation open, keeps things moving, keeps the conversation moving in a direction where we can go back and pick it up again if it comes up again. Hey, when we talked about this last time, this was how it went. Is this how you still feel? Lets them know that this is something that's not a beginning and an end, but something that's open, that mom and dad will get it when I need to talk about feelings. And that's often, a great way to, keep kids knowing that we're on their team. Basic things to keep in mind, and this goes back to all of these concepts that I've talked about today in terms of social emotional development. Help kids actively name their feelings. It looks like you're feeling mad or frustrated. She took the toy you were playing with and it made you mad. It's important for kids to have the opportunity to label. And again, we can be wrong. We can say, it looks like you're mad. And they'll say, no, I'm not mad. I'm this, or I'm whatever it is. But having the conversation and helping kids label their feelings helps kids tell their story, going through things step by step. You were playing together quietly in the sandbox. Then this kid ran by and made a loud noise. Did the loud noise make you feel scared? Did it make you feel frustrated? Being part of the story, helping them build these things and build these stories with you, helps kids know that the door is open. And again, using any and all opportunities to model feelings, as well as solutions. We're all in this right now in a different way. This is frustrating. This is not easy. Maybe we can try this. Sometimes when I'm feeling this way, this is what I do. And what's really fun about having those conversations with your kids is that sometimes they'll be surprised, or sometimes they'll learn something that they didn't know about you, or even just kids knowing that you experience those feelings too can be a big weight off their shoulders of knowing that it's not just them. And the last one I've included here, and this is really, 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 really important. I can't emphasize this enough with young kids. Letting children know that their feelings don't scare you. I know I've done this, and when kids have big feelings and maybe it's a big angry outburst or something that becomes very dramatic, we want to tell kids that what we saw scared us, or that it was, I didn't know what to do about that. But that's when we as the parent create the holding space, the safe space for them. By letting kids know that their feelings aren't scary. Maybe it's not the feelings that are scary. Maybe it's the actions that come out of those feelings that's scary. But it's important to make that distinction when we're talking to kids about big feelings. When you did this, that was scary, not the feeling being scary. And I know that's a subtlety, but reminding kids that the feeling doesn't scare you makes them feel safe. The thing that I tell parents all the time, and this starts at this young age and continues on, when you're seeing your kids express big feelings at home and they never do it at school, or they never do it with friends, or they never do it with peers, I'm about to congratulate you. If they're doing it at home, that means you have created a safe space for your kids. You're doing the right thing. Home is safe. Home is secure. Home is what it needs to be. You are doing a great job. Yes, you are the one that is dealing with the big feelings, but you are doing a good job. If your kid is showing it at home and not anywhere else, that means home is safe. And I think it's important for all parents to know that. Some other things that are important to keep in mind when we're talking to kids about these big feelings is acknowledging what their perspective is, acknowledging the child's perspective. This isn't how you wanted this to go, or maybe you wish or you hope that it would have worked out this way, so that they know maybe where their feelings lie, or that where their disappointments might be. This one is tough. If your child is crying, if we're past the biggest point of the storm of feelings, we want to jump in, we want to hug them, we want to talk to them. Part of what fosters development of self-regulation, of being able to label feelings, of being able to handle the big feelings in and of themselves, is letting there be silence. In the clinical counseling world that I work in, we call that holding space. I'm not trying to fix. I'm not trying to band-aid. I'm not trying to offer anything. All I'm offering is space. My space is safe. You are safe with me. Using our words sparingly and carefully welcomes that feeling in. And letting kids that it's okay to cry and it's okay to feel what they feel, that they're just safe. I'm right here. You're okay. It's important. Kids need to know that we're not going to be jumping in all the time, that there needs to be space, that there needs to be silence. And, piggyback on that is resisting the urge to problem solve, resisting the urge to say, here's how you fix it, here's what you do. But giving options and saying, okay, well, the next time this happens, you think you might do this. Well, what could happen then? How would that go? Just exploring it. And, kids at this age, 3, 4, and 5, love to explore those what ifs and see how far and how outlandish they can go. But this is how we teach kids to problem solve. And this is how we teach kids to cope and manage big feelings, is by talking about the possibilities and not offering one solution only, but by looking at the myriad of options that they have in front of them. If we want to talk about concrete examples of what doesn't work, calm down doesn't work. it's an automatic response that a lot of us have programmed into us, that we, it's the first thing that comes to our mind. Calm down, take it easy. Part of what that does emotionally to kids, and this is me being very hard on my sleeve therapist, is that it's, when we tell them to calm down, it's sort of like we're telling them, like, stop what you're feeling, stop it, like, don't do that. And a lot of times that can cause kids to kind of start to shut down after a while, because if we're expressing the desire that we want them to stop, then we're not holding space. We're not giving them the opportunity to do something different, a different way to manage or to learn how to manage, giving them that leeway. So I've given some suggestions here about things to say instead of calm down. I see that you're upset. Let me help. Or can I help? Leave it an open-ended question. When things kind of settle down, how about we sit down for a minute? Offering suggestions to take a deep breath. Another thing, it's frustrating, labeling those feelings. It's frustrating when things don't work out. Okay, what can we do to figure this out together? Can I give you a hug? Connection, connection, connection. This is, the way that lets them know you're not trying to shut them down. You're on their team. I have used an indoor voice on here. I include it because sometimes that's a way to kind of keep things, de-escalating as opposed to escalating. But your kids, if you know that that's not going to work on them, using that suggestion and saying use an indoor voice means we have to be regulated first as parents. So if we're screaming at them to use an indoor voice, that's not going to work. When we're dealing with these big feelings as parents, the big challenge can often be our own feelings that we're managing, because particularly, the best example I can give is something like anger. If your child is angry and you're angry because you want them to stop, you've already lost the battle, unfortunately. Whatever's going to happen from there, whatever's going to come next, isn't going to get you to a solution. So that's why calming ourselves first is going to be important. We're all doing the best that we can, and sometimes that means we have to set the example that's harder to set. But giving them options. Try walking away, try taking a deep breath. Any of these things, as opposed to just telling your kids to calm down, gives them a little more room to wiggle, or gives them a little more specific idea of what you're looking for. It's also important to talk to your kids about different strategies that they can use. And the strategies plays into that self-regulation piece. If your child is in a moment where they're having a big feeling, it's important that once you have that conversation of, okay, here, what are the things that you like to do, things that might make you feel calm, then when the situation happens again, you can say, okay, what do you want to try? And once they know the specific things, or sometimes you might have to try a few different things before you get there, when they feel more empowered about the options that are available to them when it comes to these things, then kids can learn how to self-regulate on their own. And we will see, or, we will get more familiar with what their patterns are. But part of what happens when we're just trying to calm down and we're just trying to de-escalate the situation is that we're not necessarily offering anything to them about what they can do. When we just want them to stop, we're closing the door. So this slide has some options about different strategies. But again, this can be a conversation. Kids will come up with great things on their own, and it's really important to have the conversation, because what works for us won't work for them. Or, as the situation merits right now, and is not uncommon with what we're experiencing, the things that might have usually worked for you might not work right now, because this is this is something that we weren't expecting, something that we weren't planning for. So it's don't beat yourself up if the usual things don't work, or if the things that used to make your kid feel happier, calmer aren't working. That means that sometimes we need to expand the menu a little bit, or do something that we might not normally do, because this is not something that we've all been prepared for. So these are some great suggestions. But again, it's a conversation. Talk to your kid about what they want to do. Give them some power, and that lets them know that, you know, their ideas are good and that their feelings are valid, and they can be the ones in control and not just mom and dad trying to manage it. I've given an example here, and I included belly breathing because, and I didn't even mention this until now, I am also a registered yoga teacher, and I have learned a lot about mind and body regulation. And what we are learning now, and the research is finally catching up, that our feeling states and our breathing and our body are so intricately woven together. And this can be an amazing way to manage feelings for young kids and helping them handle big feelings. Belly breathing is a great way to calm down, to put something in front of us, in front of our kids, about how we can regulate. So I'm going to talk you through this. Imagine that there's a balloon in your belly. And as you take a breath in through your nose, try to fill the balloon so that your belly puffs up. Now breathe out of your mouth like you're blowing a bubble and let all the air out of the balloon. Take some slow breaths. Try to count to 4. And when we're teaching this, sometimes we can start with 3 or 4. And as we get more practice, we can add more numbers to it. Try to count to 5. Inhale, count it out for them. Inhale, 2, 3, 4. Exhale, 2, 3, 4. And this is where, again, holding space, letting things be a little bit, which is the hardest part, because I can't even tell you, with working with different kids, and at this age in particular, when they're really, really agitated and they're trying to do the belly breathing, it can become very exaggerated and 2, 3, 4. Take the time, give them the time, hold the space, because when we're rushing through it, kids have that spidey sense of they're just trying to get me to calm down, and I don't want to, and I don't feel good. Part of what managing feelings, and managing big feelings in particular, is that we want to know what our kids experience in a positive way that works for them. And we want to use that and incorporate that all the time, not just when they're upset. Because part of what happens is that kids start to learn how to draw lines between things of, this is what I have to do, or this is how it goes. And when that line becomes more and more tightly drawn, it doesn't allow a lot of space for when something new or something unexpected happens. Part of what developing emotional awareness and social emotional development does is that when they encounter those difficult things, when they've got these habits in place of conversations with mom, or talking about feelings, or all these different things, when we have those things in place, that's when we see that kids are in fact able to manage better. And this is true for, regulating in any way, shape, or form. So I know I've said a lot, and I know that there's some questions popping up. So I will hand it over to Adam and take some questions.
Okay, sounds good. So this question, I'm going to go ahead and ask it. It may be hard to answer without a little more context, but
Hmm.
the question is defecating or urinating in place other than the toilet a product of anxiety or a sign of abuse?
Not necessarily when it comes to when it comes to um, urinating and defecating. That is often a sign of control and a need to control. So we want to look at um, the way that I'll answer this question without having further context, like you said, is that we want to rule out everything else first. We want to rule out anything medically that could be going on, which isn't always the case, but it could be. We want to look at definitely if there's any trauma or stress happening directly at the moment, because with younger kids, what we often see is that when there's direct trauma happening is when a lot of those things start to dysregulate pretty quickly, because that would, urinating and defecating in place would definitely be on my high list, with sleeping and eating. When we see any big dysregulations, and that means that we need to be looking at if there's anything anything else happening in the home.
Another question. I have two. Excuse me. We have a 2-year-old. We have 2-year-olds. Sometimes it seems like they need to know that it's time to calm down. Sometimes telling them to calm down works and seems to help them reset. Is that not helpful in the long run? If other solutions don't calm them down, do we just wait instead?
I think wait. If it works and your kids calm down when you say calm down, I think, I would say keep doing what you're doing until it stops working. But by the same token, it doesn't hurt to model some other things as well, or talk about the thing that just popped in my head. If your kids respond to calm down, you can have a conversation about what calming down means or how it feels to be calm. And sometimes that can then maybe help over the next hump of, whatever the next difficulty may be. But if your kids respond, that's amazing. It's the first time I've heard it, I think.
It's interesting. If I can just chime in a little bit on that piece. Um, it may have a lot to do, frankly, how this parent, the tone and what follows. If the parent says calm down and it is genuinely a calming
Mm-hmm.
tone and the children experience calmness afterwards, then it may actually be very effective. On the flip side, if a parent does it in a way, frankly, that's maybe scary and intimidating, it may get the child to calm down, but the child isn't really learning to self-regulate. They're uncomfortable or they're frightened. So it kind of depends, I suppose, within the context of how it's used.
Oh, 1,000%. I agree. It has to do with how we approach it always. Because, if the parents are setting the tone and approaching it calmly, then kids become the mirrors of that. And, it leads to all good things. If we're regulated, they're regulated.
I think this may be our last question. If nothing else comes through, but it's a good question. What suggestions do you have when multiple children in a family are all upset at the same time and there is one parent?
Oh, that's hard.
Yeah.
I think having been in that situation in recent weeks myself, is when we have to be honest with our kids and say nothing good is going to come right now by continuing whatever we're doing. Let's all take a break. Because when we're trying to manage and putting out multiple fires simultaneously, it's just not going to happen. And I think part of what, modeling as a parent can do is to say, this isn't working right now, and not trying to fix it, is, often the way that lets kids in on our own humanity, which is really important. Because part of what happens over time, and I could do a whole other presentation about this, part of what happens to kids over time when parents are really good at managing, those are often the kids that will struggle sometimes later on, because they'll say, oh, well, mom never looks stressed. Mom doesn't seem to struggle with it, but I do. And that's part of, you know, why having the conversation and being honest within, you know, within the context of the situation is important to say, this isn't going well right now. Let's all step off and step away for a minute and come back later. Or if you've got multiple kids, one at a time sort of thing. You need to go take a break. I'll come to you individually versus trying to manage everybody at once. But it's not easy by any measure.
Well, listen, the timing is perfect. There are no more questions. We are at 8 o'clock or just about. I want to thank everybody for showing up for this wonderful presentation. It has been recorded. Like I said, I missed maybe the first 30 seconds or so. We will be posting it hopefully sometime tomorrow on the Warren Township Youth Services website. I believe that the partnership's also going to try to post it, and I'll make sure that Gurnee Counseling gets a copy as well.
Wonderful.
Yeah, and then most importantly, though, I'd like to thank our presenter, Adriana. Thank you so much. It was wonderful. It was enlightening. I've taken tons of notes. That ruler and acronym, I'm going to use that immediately in my own life. So, oh yes, we're getting lots of chats now saying thank you, thank you, thank you.
Oh, thank you guys.
So with that, we'll go ahead and we'll wrap up. Again, if anybody has any ideas for other topics, you know, this is funny. This is normally the time of year that we start kind of slowing down our presentations and workshops. Typically, everybody's really busy at the end of the school year. I am finding, however, people are really thirsting for these opportunities to come together, get new information, hear new ideas. So if anybody has any, please don't hesitate to reach out. Again, our website is www.wtyouthservices.com. I said net before, it's .com. Thank you again. Everybody have a wonderful evening. Adriana, thank you so much.
Thank
Take
you
care.
guys. You too.
Bye-bye.